We can now get going. My technical advisors are saying it's ready to start. So welcome all of you to this World Humanitarian Forum webinar on public-private partnerships. My name is Richard Hawkes. I'm the Chief Executive of an international NGO called the British Asian Trust, and I'm honoured to be a member of the advisory board for the World Humanitarian Forum. I'm very, very pleased to be moderating today's event. Before I introduce the excellent panel who've so kindly given up their time to join us today, I'd just like to say a few words about the World Humanitarian Forum. So the WHF is the largest and most inclusive non-partisan forum in humanitarian aid and international development. It brings together decision makers and opinion formers in the public, private and non-profit sectors, as well as the next generation of partnership builders. The annual forum advances critical global discussions and provides a powerful opportunity to catalyse collaboration between major players from government, aid, development and innovation, all aimed to improve the lives of millions in need. For obvious reasons, the physical forum has had to be postponed from this year, and it will now be taking place in May next year. But instead, the World Humanitarian Forum has developed this webinar series, all part of a larger digital program that brings together individuals, companies and organizations to discuss the critical issues shaping the humanitarian and international development agendas today and tomorrow. The title of today's session is Public-Private Partnerships, discussing the transformative potential of cross-sector cooperation. The role of private organizations in assisting with humanitarian responses is crucial when looking at crises ranging from disasters to pandemics. Indeed, for the UN SDGs to be successful, it's simply imperative that the private sector plays an active role, from supporting climate change efforts to eradicating slavery from supply chains to eliminating gender inequality. In this webinar, we will explore the benefits and possibilities of public-private partnerships, as well as the challenges. I'm delighted that on our panel today, we're joined by Louise Holden, Vice President, Humanitarian and Development, Mastercard, by Dianne Dain, who very kindly has joined us with very little notice, with just one day's notice. We're very grateful to her, and she's the UN Reboot Accelerator Lead in the Strategy, Policy and Governance Division. We're also joined by Andrew Dunnett, the Group Director for SDGs, Sustainable Business and Foundations at Vodafone, and by Helena Dollimore, Senior Manager in Global Sustainability at Unilever. I'd now like to ask the panelists to introduce themselves and give a brief summary about their role and their company. And if it's okay with you, Louise, we'll start with you.
Delighted. Thanks very much, Richard. And hello, everybody, wherever you're dialing in from today. So my name is Louise Holden. I've been with Mastercard for 13 years, and I work in their Humanitarian and Development Team. I wanted to open up by just sharing with you how we look at partnerships, the variety of those partnerships, and how they're even more important today. As you all probably know, Mastercard's core capability is enabling safe, secure, smart commerce. We connect buyers and sellers all over the world. But we recognize that the problems of the world are too big to think small. Globally, over 1 billion people lack a basic ID. 1 billion people don't have access to primary healthcare, and over 250 million children can't go to school. And this challenge is only going to be exacerbated by the pandemic. There isn't enough foreign assistance, philanthropy, and corporate social responsibility commitments to solve the global challenges we face. Mastercard already align our core assets to social good. 5 years ago, we made a commitment to onboard 500 million financially excluded individuals into the financial economy. We've done that, we've achieved it about a month ago, and we're now focused on extending our commitment to bring in a total of 1 billion by 2025. We've also set up 2 large philanthropic organizations, the Mastercard Foundation and the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth. They both, between them, grant hundreds of millions of dollars to programs globally to advance their priorities of inclusive growth, data for good, and the future of work. But over the last 10 years, Mastercard's also made some strategic commercial investments in people, partnerships, and technology to grow our business, which addresses the needs of the underserved, those at the base of the pyramid, And there's around 4.5 billion individuals living on less than $8 a day. My team builds commercially sustainable digital social impact programs with our partners. We make sure that they're fair, inclusive, and affordable. We work in agriculture, health, education, commerce, and humanitarian. We bring our technicians, our solution engineers, our data experts, as well as our scale experience to work alongside our public and private sector partners to build solutions which neither of us could build on our own. And we call this community pass. We embed user-centered design thinking to ensure the solutions work for the betterment of individuals and hard-to-reach communities, those that are often left behind in the digital world. The key point here is that this is commercially sustainable social enterprise. Our partnerships and programs must be commercially sustainable and scalable if we're going to deliver on the promise of inclusive growth. This isn't philanthropy. It makes good business sense because businesses can't thrive in a failing world. And our approach of combining philanthropy, core assets, and building commercially sustainable social impact programs has been accelerated in the current crisis. An inclusive response to COVID-19 is paramount, and we've got to focus on the near and the long term. I think the crisis has really highlighted how interconnected our world is. We're working with our partners to address the threat to health and economic security this pandemic poses, and to build towards a recovery that's fast, full, and equitable. So what Mastercard's done to help, we have philanthropically invested 25 million into a therapeutics accelerator program run by Gates and Wellcome to advance the production of COVID-19 therapeutics. We've also commercially supported small businesses to the tune of 250 million. We've also made many of our cyber intelligence and resilience tools to protect the increasing numbers of organizations and businesses that have to go online. And we've made those free of charge, free at point of access until the end of the year. We've also stood up around 190 disbursement programs since the pandemic hit. And we're working with our global health partners, Gavi and the Global Fund, to help digitize vaccination records, leverage data programs to help them digitize, prioritize health programs, and working to strengthen last mile community health programs. So tons to talk about, really pleased to be here, but back to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Louise. It's absolutely incredible the amount that Mastercard is doing, and I'm looking forward to fleshing some of that out in a bit more detail in the discussion. Now let's head across the pond to Dianne over in New York, if that's okay, Dianne.
Thank you, Richard. I'm Dianne Dain. Thank you to the World Humanitarian Forum for having me today. Appreciate the fact that we get to join together and talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, which is public-private partnerships. I lead the partnerships for the ICT division at the UN Secretariat, and I've helped establish the UN Technology Innovation Labs globally. We've done a lot of work in that realm, as well as now I currently lead the UN Reboot Accelerator, which is designed to engage and activate youth, not only to become problem solvers, but also to connect them with resources, mentors, innovators, accelerators, people that can support and sustain these solutions. Because like Louise pointed out, the challenges that we face are of scale and they need sustainable solutions. And that is the biggest challenge that we face. We can see that we're all now on the same page and really primarily suffering through something that's very common to each one of us for the first time, really. And so we're really grateful to have this opportunity to speak about how can we build a better world? How can we build back better in 2020? We've definitely left the world of 2019 behind. We started the Decade of Action already in January. We announced it at Davos. We had some great initiatives there, but now we've kind of pivoted and we're addressing other issues. So I'm really happy to join today and to talk about how we can build these partnerships for a better future.
That's great, Dianne. Thank you very much. And I'm sure that everybody's looking forward to finding out a bit more about the work that you're doing in the UN, which also sounds absolutely fascinating. And I'm going to come back over to the UK and ask Andrew from Vodafone if you could just do your introductory remarks, please, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Well, as with others, it's a great pleasure to be on the panel and really looking forward to hearing what others have said. And likewise, you know, it was amazing to hear what Louise was saying, particularly about Mastercard. And the huge commitment that they've made both in recent days to COVID, but also in the way they're structuring. And I couldn't agree more. Sorry, Richard, you don't want panelists to agree, but I couldn't agree more with Dianne with regards to sustainability and scale as being absolutely key. I mean, from a Vodafone perspective, for those on the call not familiar with Vodafone, we began as a mobile operator in 1985. We have about 362 million customers that we service every day of the week across around about 22 markets where we have mobile, 17 where we have fixed, and then a further 45 where we have a sort of partner market arrangement. We also service about 1,400 of the world's largest companies with all their communications needs through a business function. And I think the sort of starting point for me is it's quite common in Vodafone to sort of ask the question, where's the world going and what's our role in it? In terms of sort of getting behind, why do we exist as a company and why are we here? And I think the sort of something that a lot of people in the company are very familiar with, if you go back to 2028, 29, 10 years ago, 1% of the working population globally were constantly connected. Now it's around about 85% of the working population are constantly connected. It's the biggest revolution that has ever happened in history. And those in the communications industry are part of that extraordinary revolution that's taking place. But in many ways, it's just beginning. And I think there are 5 things that are going to happen or already happening that are going to be transformational as well. They're obviously the smartphone revolution, the only innovation in history that's gone from innovation to ubiquity within a generation. The extraordinary growth in cloud, seeing a 17% growth this year alone. IoT and what that will mean in terms of our home life, our cities, our working life. We're beginning to see that already in the current crisis. AI, which Accenture described recently, was the biggest innovation, the biggest disruption since the Industrial Revolution, which is just beginning to gather momentum. And of course, autonomous robots and cars. And all of that requires network and connectivity. So I think when you're sort of, you're looking at partnerships and you're looking at, why do companies exist? What is the role of Mastercard? What is the role of Vodafone? Why do we exist as businesses? Then for us, you'll very quickly turn to a sense of that extraordinary revolution, which we're all in the middle of, and what is coming down the track from that revolution, how that is going to transform life in extraordinary ways. And so my role in that very small role, I lead the 2 teams globally. I lead the foundation team. We invest 45 million euros every year. Again, similar to what Louise was talking about, a move from the sort of old style checkbook charity to bringing not only some cash, some patient capital in a very fast industry, some patient capital to the table that you can invest along with the technology and along with the people skills that an organization of 100,000 people has, and engineering and so on and so forth. So I'm responsible for that across 27 countries. A lot of experience of partnerships with USAID, Elton John AIDS Foundation, DFID, Google.org, all of these organizations we have all been working with, and many more. So lots to sort of say about that. Then I also work with I lead the sustainable business function, and that has been more and more integrated into the company. So whether it's issues around our license to operate, fully integrated into the company, whether it's a view as to how we deliver on our planet ambitions for the SDGs. Again, we're integrating more and more of those decisions into the company where it's much more effectively managed and delivered. But I lead that team as well globally. So I'll leave it there, Richard, because I think it's 3 minutes up. But that's sort of a starter from me.
That's great, Andrew. Thank you very much. I just before I introduce Helena, I have to say I've worked in international development for more than 25 years, and the way the landscape has changed so much, especially with regards to the role that corporates play. It's absolutely brilliant, absolutely fascinating. 25 years ago, it was just a very, very different picture, and especially in the way that the not-for-profit sector, which I've always worked in, engaged with the private sector. But we'll come on to some of that a bit later. I guess Helena, you're from Unilever. Many of us will know the tremendous work that Unilever does. In many ways, you've been at the forefront of a lot of this over the years. So it'd be great if you could just introduce yourself and say a few words of introduction.
Yeah, thanks, Richard, and great to be with everyone on this webinar. And again, big thanks to the World Humanitarian Forum for hosting us, and really good to hear what others are already doing to respond to coronavirus on the webinar. As Richard's mentioned, I work in the global sustainability team at Unilever, and I'm focused on health and well-being. And as part of that, I work on our efforts to improve access to safe water and sanitation across the world, and also our response to humanitarian emergencies and our efforts to promote mental health. As you can probably imagine, with a remit like that, since the outbreak of COVID-19, my role has been pretty much completely focused on our response to the pandemic. And I want to open up by just telling you a bit about how Unilever is responding to coronavirus. Obviously, our overall response has been shaped by our long-standing stakeholder model of business. As Richard, as you've mentioned, for a long time, we believe that businesses should operate for the benefit of everyone in their value chain, and that's really shaped our response. Our response really has been targeted at every stage of the value chain. So starting from workers and employees, we've committed to guarantee all jobs and incomes through to the end of Q2. We've been helping suppliers in our value chain by offering cash flow relief and also early payment terms for small and medium businesses that we work with to help them. And then to help the communities and consumers that we serve, we've committed to donate 100 million euros worth of products, hygiene products like soap and sanitizer. And we're working with a range of third sector organisations, civil society and UN agencies like the UN Refugee Agency and UNICEF to do that product donation. But really, I think and hopefully we will come on to this in the discussion later, I think where businesses like ours can really add value is by leveraging our expertise and our core competencies as a business. Unilever, as the world's largest manufacturer of soap and a company that has a deep heritage in soap and hygiene education, we believe we have a lot to offer in helping people to change their behaviour so that they wash their hands with soap more. And we've been doing that for decades, but perhaps the world has never needed more people to wash their hands more with soap than now. So we've partnered with the UK's Department of International Development in a £100 million contribution to tackle coronavirus overseas. And I think I'll get the opportunity to talk a bit more about that later on in the webinar. So lots to talk about, and back to you, Richard.
Helena, that's great. Thank you very much. And thank all of you very much for those introductory remarks. So just so that everybody who's participating knows, there have been questions that have been submitted in advance, as well as questions that the World Health Humanitarian Forum felt would be good prompts for this discussion. And I'm going to try and incorporate as many of those as I can. Obviously, there are a lot of questions about COVID-19, but we'll come on to some of those later. Just to start with, let's just explore in a little bit more detail the concept of cross-sector partnerships. And I just wonder, maybe Louise, if we could start with you, what would you say are the biggest challenges to creating successful collaborations between private and public organisations?
Sure, great question, Richard. So I'm going to share what we've learned from our experience of creating partnerships, and some have been successful and some have been potentially less successful. But I'm going to go on the upside first about some of the key kind of common elements of a successful partnership. And what we found is that successful partnerships, they can be built between organisations that don't look the same, come from the same background, or indeed work in the same sector. But if organisations can complement each other by bringing this is a point to what Helena was talking about, their key assets, their kind of core DNA, their unique strengths, they can leverage off each other and build something, do something, create a partnership which they couldn't have done on their own. So it's about that collaboration, but the collaboration doesn't need to come from a traditional, your traditional sector or from an organisation that necessarily looks like you or feels like you, a bit like humans, really. Strong partnerships need to operate on shared trust, and trust is a really important piece of any relationship, whether it be corporate or personal. Shared values help, but certainly a shared vision. It also helps between the players in the organizations having a shared energy. It's also really important to have senior level executive support on both sides. We've been incredibly fortunate in our CEO, Ajay, who has had a very clear vision for how Mastercard should strike partnerships and the velocity and the volume of those partnerships. And he has disseminated that support all the way through the organization. And that is so important in removing roadblocks, increasing prioritization, enabling kind of resource mobilization, and helps you build something which you couldn't necessarily do on your own again. Strong partnerships, we've found, are based on a challenge-led, user-centric, co-created solutions. And those enable, particularly when you're looking at a public-private kind of partnership, enables the private sector to bring their innovation expertise and their people to the table to solve challenges alongside public sector. You don't want a solution to chase a problem, but you want it the other way around. So I'm going to be slightly controversial now and say that some of the kind of strongest and certainly most sustainable kind of partnerships that we've seen, they're not based on buyer-supplier. You know, procurement and a buyer-supplier relationship can be really useful to procure a specific item from the private sector. But in strong kind of PPP partnerships, procurement rules often don't work. Procurement is predicated on the understanding that public sector knows exactly what it needs to see happen. They can get there by market consultation and research, but it doesn't allow the process to be iterative. And in that iterative process, by bringing your best people, your assets, your capabilities to that partnership, I think you can come up with something far greater than you originally intended when you started. I'm going to finish on one point, if that's okay. Commercials and business case. It's really important in a partnership to address this early on, as it can be a key sticking point. Being honest about at which point somebody needs to be paid for this is key. Working out who's going to pay for it in the longer term to ensure it's sustainable is also key. Now, they might be different organizations that help kickstart a partnership and a different organization that takes on that partnership. And that different organization might be an organization that sees the value in that service delivery or the value in the cost savings from the partnership. But unless the costs are covered in the longer term, then the program is at risk of failing and the services stop, and nobody wants that. And how a foundation invests in a partnership is different how a sustainability team invests in a partnership and how a commercial division invests in a partnership. So working out the gives and the gets all the way through the business case is really important to flush out some of these, sometimes tricky, but really honest and open things that you need to decide when you form a partnership. I'll pause at that point.
Louise, I'm going to abuse my position in the chair and just ask a couple of things specific on what you said. I mean, a lot of the things you've mentioned there are absolutely key to any partnership, you know, in terms of the senior leadership and agreeing, you know, all the agreements that you said need to be in place and so on. Do you think there's a difference between, if you look at partnerships that you might have with other private sector organizations, and then partnerships with either the public sector or the not-for-profit sector? Are there any things within those, you know, is there anything that's fundamentally different about partnerships with the public sector or the not-for-profit sector that might not be there in your partnerships with other private sector organizations?
You know what? The points I was making about executive leadership and about energy and about shared kind of values and vision, I think that they are fundamentally the same. They might be sometimes might take a little bit longer to get there, but there's no reason why they can't be got. And they're really important in any kind of partnership from whatever kind of sector, whether it be civil, public, private, large or small. I think those are fundamental building blocks for any kind of partnership. Business cases are different. And the expectations of building out the investment model, the de-risking model, the pricing model, and understanding and working through the kind of gates that you need to go through with any kind of design, iteration, pilot, and then scale phase. They have taken a little bit longer, and they sometimes require multiple organizations to come in at different points to be able to engage in that program. So that's a fundamental difference. The other piece, I said it was really important, but it still needs to be worked on, is trust. we're all seeing many more partnerships, collaborations, both bilateral and multilateral, come about between private and public sector. And these are types of organizations, even though all staffed by human beings, can have different levels of trust and understanding motivations and understanding kind of objectives. And I think that we have within the world today and in the nature of partnerships, we still have a little bit of a way to go to be able to build that trust, to be able to understand motivations, to be able to recognize that organizations might come from a different background, but they are in it for a shared goal. And that shared goal can be common, it can be impactful, and it could have strong social impact. So I think that those are the key differences.
That's great. Thank you very much. Andrew, I just wonder if there's anything you want to come in and comment on all of that or add to that question.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what Louise was saying, and I think just to sort of give two examples from our perspective, one from the company and one from a philanthropic perspective. So, I mean, if you take the company perspective, and most of you have probably heard of it, I would say the whole M-Pesa platform, the mobile money transfer platform that we launched in Kenya, 12 years ago now, to enable the unbanked to save credit in their phone and then transfer that credit mobile to mobile, and then they could take the credit out at a roadside seller. And I was just sort of looking at the latest numbers, which are quite extraordinary for that platform. 50 million are using it in Africa, 12 billion transactions, 147 billion euros transacted, through that platform. Africa's largest mobile money transfer platform. Now, of course, that was built on a DFID grant. That was a DFID partnership. That is when it began. It began in the Sustainable Business Team 15 years ago. And a guy called Nick Hughes had the idea. He was really focused on markets where there were 80% people were unbanked, and how could the mobile revolution enable them to get access to money much more effectively than they did when they were just keeping it on their person. So I think that was an extraordinary innovation. Estimate 30-40% of the GDP of Kenya going through that platform at the moment. And what are the learnings from that? I think they're similar to some of the things Louise said. Number one, the leadership. Michael Joseph was the CEO of Safaricom at the time, and felt a real commitment to launch it and do it. You had an individual, Nick Hughes, who now runs a company called M-Kopa, which is, I think, Africa's largest off-grid power company, using embedded SIMs within solar cells, so people can pay for it in stages. And it had patient capital. You know what I mean? That there was a patience there around the innovation. There wasn't an expectation, particularly from Safaricom, where it first launched, of an immediate return on capital invested. So, I think from a commercial side, for us, if you say, well, what's the best example of a public-private partnership or a public funding of a private initiative with a very significant public benefit coming out of it, I'd go for M-Pesa. If you go into philanthropic space, we did a $20 million program, which is still ongoing with USAID, where we were addressing a very specific issue, which is around the MDGs, now the SDGs, of women getting access to emergency maternal treatment. Outside the main cities, what was happening is, a large contributor towards the maternal deaths was the fact that people in maternal crisis were walking, obstetric crisis were walking to the nearest clinic, getting a bike to the nearest clinic. And as a result of this, of course, the maternal deaths were about, I think, 450 per 100,000, very, very high. And what we did as a result of an innovation from one of the large charity hospitals in the country was we just put all their ambassadors on mobile money, and through that platform we began to pay to enable women to get access to treatment rapidly, so that taxis would go as ambulances paid for on M-Pesa and bring them into hospitals. And that program, McKinsey did a study on it last year, saw a 27% reduction in maternal mortality where it's running. And now we're running that program in Lesotho. We're planning to run it in Ghana. So I think the second thing, the thing we've learned on partnerships in the foundation space is really the point Dianne was making about sustainability. It's very difficult to know your exit before you get in. because sometimes it can be very unclear as to what that exit is. But I think if you're really focused on either a handover to government funding or other ways of of finding ways of making it sustainable in the long term. I think if you're not thinking about it from the start, then you're likely to fail. But sometimes it's very difficult to see where the exit is. And then if you're not willing to take a risk, then are you really actually innovating, or are you moving into some form of grant making, which is great for some, but isn't really where we're at. So those are sort of two lessons we've learned in the commercial space and in the philanthropic space.
Yeah, very good. Very, very interesting. I'm on a personal mission in the next half an hour to see if I can find something that you and Louise can disagree about. So let's just moving on to something about the UN. So Dianne, you'll know that one very successful initiative, which the World Humanitarian Forum has been very happy to be a part of, that's bringing together the public and private sectors during the COVID pandemic, is the COVID-19 Solidarity Response Fund for the WHO. This is a first of its kind platform for the private sector to support global efforts to contain and mitigate the ongoing pandemic. Due to the success of this initiative, do you think we can expect to see more UN initiatives that aim to ask for contributions and support from businesses directly?
I think absolutely. I mean, I would hope so, because to Andrew and Louise's point, we can't solve these problems without the private sector. And the organizations on this call, Unilever, Vodafone, Mastercard, they're very progressive in their partnerships, and they're very collaborative. And we need more of that, because there's too much silos that I see going on in the philanthropy world around resources and around that divide us, to be perfectly honest. So we need to solve the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which were built largely for the member states. And to be honest, I don't think the private sector has completely figured out how to incorporate them in their business processes. And I think that in and of itself, which actually the UN Global Compact is coming out with a set of 10 principles that will be able to be set as Sustainable Development Goals ambitions for corporate targets. That will be key as we move forward. I think they're announcing them in June 15th at their 20th year anniversary, the details of what those might mean. But I think that change, if we want real change to happen, we want to leave the partnerships of yesterday behind, and we really want to create change from within the company, not just the corporate social responsibility. We want the whole structure to be accountable, from supply chain all the way through to how we deliver humanitarian services and how we work together. So when we talk about that challenge that you just described, the One World for the WHO, it was very exciting because it engaged youth. I mean, Global Citizen got involved and galvanized all these youth and these performers. You had everyone to get working together and pushing this forward. And it was massively successful. I think to date, UN Foundation is the main partner, and the Swiss Foundation, and the last count I think was $214 million for COVID, which WHO is going to be able to use to provide innovations for countries that aren't going to be able to survive, that are going to have extreme challenges. So yes, I do think that this is the wave of the future. This is the new way of working. It's a new way of partnerships. It's a new way of creating this new world that we're literally walking into a new world and a new way of operating. And the UN has some tools that are going to help us get there. And so that's my hope and desire.
So you really feel that both this kind of initiative and the sort of recent experiences indicate a real shift in the way that the public and private sectors will work together in the future?
Absolutely. I think we're all united. And as Dr. Tedros has said so many times, around solidarity. We just finished a challenge in the UN Reboot Accelerator with the WHO, with their whole innovation unit. And it was rebooting health and wellness for the bottom 3 billion youth who can't have access to connectivity, many of the benefits that we currently have. So there's a lot of, we've engaged, we got hundreds and hundreds of responses and innovations, and you'll be hearing more about the winners because WHO is going to actually really promote this and embrace this. And so the connecting is, you get youth, you engage them, you connect them with resources and mentors, because, I'm old and I'm going to extend my life by partnering with youth that actually can innovate and have really a clear vision for tomorrow and the world that they want to create. So yes, I do. That's a short answer.
Just for the record, I've always regarded myself as young. But thanks for making me feel even older than I do. Helena, just moving on to you and Unilever, just about that shift in the way that these partnerships might work in the future. I mean, Unilever's got a huge amount of experience of relationships, especially with the British government, which you mentioned earlier. But do you think recent experiences are going to lead to a big shift in the way that these partnerships will work?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I think in terms of whether we are seeing a shift, I would say we are seeing an acceleration during the pandemic. I think we've all been, hearing about what our various organisations are doing in response to coronavirus, but this is just a fraction of the work going on. And I think one of the things that's been really coming out during the crisis, one of the pieces actually of small pieces of good news amidst all of the bad news we've been hearing, is the way that businesses, small and large, have been stepping up and really showing that there are crises like the one we find ourselves in now, where we can only solve it if we all act together across all sectors, governments, business, civil society, and individuals as well playing their part. So I think this has really brought to the fore the unique skills and competencies that businesses can bring to challenges like this. We've seen, in the UK, we've seen businesses helping to make manufacture ventilators for hospitals. We've seen businesses switching production lines over to make more PPE, more sanitizer, and tech businesses using their skills to make contact tracing apps, which are now being rolled out. And Unilever's been pleased to be part of many of these efforts. We were part of the UK Ventilator Consortium in the UK. We've switched our production lines over that normally make deodorant and beauty products to make sanitizer and hygiene products. And as you can probably imagine, as the world's biggest manufacturer of soap, we've been very busy meeting that increased demand and scaling up so that we can get hygiene products to those who need them around the world. But as I've mentioned before, one of our biggest contributions is in the expertise that we have as a company with a long history in hygiene, and specifically encouraging people to wash their hands more with soap at key occasions. Our founder, William Lever, set up the business back in the late 19th century, and he said the purpose of our business should be to make cleanliness commonplace. And that has really come out most of all in this pandemic. So Lifebuoy, which is one of the world's largest soap brands and is a Unilever brand, for a long time has been focused on encouraging people to change their behaviour and wash their hands more with soap. 10 years ago, as part of the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, which you may be familiar with, Lifebuoy set themselves a very ambitious target to improve the hand washing behaviours of 1 billion people, and they actually passed that target last year. So they really excelled in that effort. And the way they did that was by reaching people through on-ground programs, in schools, going into communities, working with mothers, working with specific vulnerable populations like refugee populations. And that's really given us in this crisis a lot of expertise in how you get people to wash their hands and how you raise awareness at scale. So what we're doing with DFID is we've partnered in a £100 million contribution to tackling COVID-19 overseas. What Unilever bring to the table is our expertise in hygiene behaviour change, a lot of educational materials and models of how you change behaviour, public health messaging, and of course access to soap and hygiene products. And then we're combining that in the partnership with the support of DFID in terms of cash, and also the support of NGOs who have great footprints around the world. They're really in communities already, and the ability to scale up these programs quickly. So I think we're really seeing at moments of crisis like this, the skills of businesses really being brought in, complementing the skills of NGOs and governments to scale up quickly and meet the challenge. And just to touch on one specific approach that we're using as part of that is working specifically with refugee populations. So a few years ago, we designed a program with Oxfam called Mum's Magic Hands, which was designed really to address a gap that existed in the global humanitarian system, which was helping people follow hand washing practices in humanitarian situations, whether that is, you know, a population who have suddenly moved or been displaced, or a refugee population perhaps in a camp setting where the routine of daily life gets disrupted. And it can be often moments like that when diseases, waterborne diseases can spread very easily. And we designed that approach to be the only hand washing in emergencies program with Oxfam. That approach is now being used as part of our partnership with DFID to help the refugee populations around the world where we're extremely worried about the spread of coronavirus. And I think one of the other aspects that really comes out in this crisis is, you know, for a long time at Unilever, we've been advocating for investment in WASH infrastructure. That's, you know, water and sanitation infrastructure. Everyone should have access to safe hygiene, safe sanitation and infrastructure wherever they live and whoever they are. But I think a moment like this really shows the importance of that for the whole world. You know, we will not get to the end of this pandemic and eradicate coronavirus until everybody has access to that basic WASH infrastructure and is aware of what they need to do to tackle this virus. So I think it's also a moment where we see the importance of, you know, the SDGs and many of the efforts that our partnerships have been working towards for many years.
Yeah, no, that's great. I can imagine over the last 50 years, people that produce soap wondering how on earth are we going to get people to wash their hands with soap more? And so suddenly for the whole world to be told, wash your hands for twice as long, about 5 times a day. I think we're hugely grateful, though, that, as you said, if Unilever is the world's largest producer of soap, that it's Unilever that is that, i.e. a company with such a tremendous sense of social purpose at its heart, which is absolutely imperative at the moment, as you've conveyed. I just wonder whether from Louise or Andrew, are there any sort of specific examples? You both touched on it a little bit, but directly related with COVID, are there any specific initiatives that either of you have been involved in that are similar to the ones that Helena outlined from Unilever?
Do you want to go first, Andrew? Or?
I'm just trying. Yeah, I think I'm unmuted. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I don't want to bore you with a corporate advert, but I mean, I think the, you know, we 200 million euros worth of in-kind, similar to, I think, what Louise was talking about. We responded with that across markets, sort of zero-rated hotlines to health hotlines, equipment, all the usual sort of stuff that big corporations should step in and do. 10 million euros of direct cash. We're also involved in the, you know, the event Dianne was talking about with Global Citizen, and we put the contribution into that fund. And we've done an interesting piece of research around an app that we've had called Dream Lab, which 800,000 customers have downloaded, where you can work with Imperial College and let your smartphone at night be used as the computing power in your smartphone, citizen science, linking all these smartphones together to help as the scientists at Imperial are looking at existing foodstuffs which might be effective in treating patients and preventing the spread of the virus, and that's very popular internally. You know, there's a big internal audience for all of us who work in large companies, as well as thinking about you know, consumers and customers out there. But if I could just make one comment as well before I hand to Louise, you know, I think there's Paul Polman, who's you know, familiar with everybody on the panel. You know, I mean, he said recently, you know, there's a move from business as usual to business as unusual. And I think, as always with Paul, he sort of captures it in a real essence. And I think there's a lot in that. I think there are a lot of drivers, and we haven't got time because this panel isn't about the drivers, which is changing the way business looks at the SDGs or looks at its wider responsibilities. But I think, you know, the executive committees of all the companies represented on here today, I think every single member would feel that they are failing in their fiduciary responsibilities if they don't factor in the social and environmental impact of their decision making. Now, whether you could say that 10 or 15 years ago, you know, I don't know, but that is the sort of level of engagement, you know, that is there. And therefore, I think when I mean, obviously COVID is is a unique event. We've seen nothing like it in terms of its global reach and impact and everything else. So you would expect it for that. But I think Paul was right. There is a change from the business as usual to business as unusual. But anyway, sorry, Louise, I'll hand over to you.
No, that was great, Andrew. I mean, I'm just going to build on your point, which is going to, I'm afraid, not give Richard any ammunition. The fact that Andrew and I are not going to disagree on this at all. But 2 examples. I mean, we're all in this together. I know that we're impacted in different ways, and lockdown is very different from one person to another. What's happening in Global North is very different to what's happening in Global and will happen in Global South. I'm sure we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later on. But individuals within organizations are also on point and keen to help. And one example of this was Ajay was chairing a all hands call about six, seven weeks ago. And he said, look, we know that we want to increase the effort and the velocity of some of our internal programs. For example, donation platforms, for example, government disbursement programs to help those vulnerable and economically disadvantaged to, for example, look at the digital health work, which I'll talk about in a second. I need some help. We need some help. We're going to call for volunteers. And I would like you in the time that we're running this call to drop me an email personally and let me know whether you're going to join a project team. This is going to be on top of your day job, and you'll have to do it kind of on the side, but it will be around some of these fundamental kind of pieces of work which Mastercard is committed to do to help our partners and our kind of countries help with their COVID-19 responses. He asked for a volunteer group of 50. And by the end of the call, he had 500 volunteers. We've surged around, I think about 50% of those now onto internal projects. So these are people who already in their, kind of implications of working remotely and everything else that we're all kind of getting used to. They've taken on additional work to do this. So there's a will within private and public to, that we're in this together. And just another little example of some of the work that we're doing. It's to kind of call out some of the point I was making about non-traditional kind of sector working and how some great partnerships can come out of non-traditional partners. So we have one with the organization Gavi, and anyone involved in COVID will know Gavi's role in the identification, design, production, and distribution of essential life-giving vaccines. We've worked with them to bring our core kind of expertise, which is around digitizing transactions. But instead of digitizing a payment transaction, we have digitized a health transaction, and that health transaction is a vaccination record. So it's a tool that enables the capture of a patient or caregiver's ID, can identify what are the right vaccinations to give to that individual, and can track the adherence to that vaccination schedule, as well as communications out to the carer to remind them to come back in, data that reports up to Ministry of Health to manage the stock management, as well as the again adherence to the schedule. These are digitization kind of scenarios which we're used to in payments, but we've applied them into health. And this is a solution now that we're looking to adapt and evolve to particularly address COVID-19 and the eventual vaccination that will be rolled out in 2021. But it's an interesting kind of example of application of your core DNA, apply it into a different sector, combination of an organization you don't historically have partnered with, and how that can directly help accelerate, manage, and support a COVID-19 program.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating again. Louise, you mentioned there at the start about the, and I'm going to come to everyone on this, about the different, the way that COVID-19 is impacting in the global north and the global south. And I just wonder if we can just explore a little bit what the impact is going to be specifically in poorer countries, particularly specifically in the global south, and whether what sorts of initiatives that any of you are working on that are specifically focused at the longer term impact and recovery that's going to be needed in the global south, and what the role is for these kinds of cross-sector partnerships in ensuring the success of all of that as well.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe, yeah, Louise, if you'd like to kick off, and then Dianne, maybe we'll come to you after that as well.
Yeah. So I'll try and do this as swiftly as possible. I mean, there's a great degree of concern around Global South, and obviously we're seeing the first implications of that. In our work in the Therapeutics Accelerator with Gates and Wellcome, we are one of the reasons that we joined that is to help with the fair, equitable, inclusive distribution of therapeutics and vaccines into Global South, which is at a later stage of the pandemic than Global North. These are regions where the health infrastructure is weaker, economic resilience is weaker, and there are real challenges on social isolation, on how you earn an income, and how individuals kind of live in proximity. I mean, we've been working in these communities for some time, particularly to look at ways that we can partner to build economic resilience. Our financial inclusion programs are incredibly important in those environments by giving individuals the ability to make and receive digital payments, to be able to make a small saving, to make it easier for them to live their life and save kind of some of the cost implications of living in a cash world. So we are in our focus has always been on ensuring the health and well-being of communities, and health and well-being is inextricably linked to economic and social progress. And poverty contributes to ill health, and ill health contributes to poverty. So the investment in our Community Pass program is fundamental for transforming the delivery of essential services to those at the bottom of the pyramid. Digital, I think, is really essential to fully understand the ramifications of COVID-19 in the communities which we care about, and to deliver those kind of therapeutics and care to the communities on the margin. I think we see the impact and the importance of digital infrastructure, how essential that is. Technology alone won't, solve the crisis, but the systems and the services have to be able to talk to each other and effectively kind of reach those individuals who it's more challenging to reach because they're living in at the last mile. I think the role of local partners and working with local organizations is absolutely key. We have a range of kind of different partnership models, both global, local, regional, last mile. And last mile partners who are closer to end users and understand the local nuances and local context. Those partners can be private, they can be public, but working with them not only leads to kind of greater insight, but it helps build their own kind of capacity and capability for the future. So we are looking at accelerating those partnerships, about working with those local essential kind of last mile partners to be able to reach some of the end users, laying the foundations for digital infrastructure to help service delivery and help build economic resilience and the capacity for livelihood improvement for the future. But we're very concerned about what's happening with particularly refugee camps. I think Helena mentioned that, and in some of the kind of high concentration urban environments where the transmission is already accelerating.
Thank you very much, Dianne. And then once Dianne's contributed here, I'll see if Helen and Andrew have anything specifically to add to this point. So Dianne, over to you, please.
Thank you. I would just add that the divide has always been there, and digital is the latest version. And it's something that we're very concerned about. As the UN technology arm, we're definitely concerned about the connectivity, the lack of connectivity, the lack of emerging technologies that are being developed in these countries that don't have access to connectivity, nor some of the solutions that are being developed that produce the 10x return. And as we set up these UN Technology Innovation Labs, they started a few years ago. And as we went to different countries, something that was touched on earlier is trust. And trust was at the core, country to country, of the success and the ability for us to not only build successful partnerships, but to progress and build technologies that were able to scale and be sustainable. So it's really interesting because so many of the topics that we've touched on are really critical to moving this forward. At the UN has a technology transfer bank, and we have 48 countries which we've identified as least developed countries. And these technologies that we will be developing, they have to be scalable, they have to be sustainable, they have to be socially and environmentally sensitive to each area and location. So they need to be tested. It's a massive undertaking. And at the end of the day, they have to be open source, and they have to be attainable through a technology transfer bank where these countries that are least developed, they're also in greatest risk for environmental destruction that is fast approaching. I mean, this has nothing to do with, I'm not even touching on COVID here. I'm touching on what we are endeavoring in January of this year. And now it's just gotten a whole lot worse for these countries. But at the end of the day, we do have a technology transfer bank that we're beginning to bank technologies, and we will help them train in the 48 least developed countries to assimilate some of these emerging technologies into their country's infrastructure to help them survive and catch up. Because like I said, this divide is not decreasing, this divide is only increasing. And we're struggling to catch up with that and to help provide solutions.
Thank you. I'm being told to move soon to the concluding remarks, but there's another question I want to ask. So I'm just going to take the unilateral decision to allow you all to shorten your concluding remarks to 1 or 1.5 minutes, which we'll come to in a second. But so let's just see if Helena or Andrew want to come in on that specific point, and then there's one other question I want to ask after that.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I think, you know, as I've touched upon in my earlier answer, obviously we're very concerned with the spread of coronavirus and the impact on it of communities, you know, across the world, but particularly in the global south. And that's what our partnership with IFID is hoping to address and aimed at addressing. But I think also there's a broader point about the issues that all of us as progressive businesses and humanitarians who are part of the World Humanitarian Forum work on. And there's a risk that we really take a big step backwards in this pandemic. So I think, you know, we think about the immediate impact of the pandemic, of course, is acute, but there's, you know, other issues which we may not immediately think of that are impacting people. So, for example, Louise was talking about Gavi, and we've got a partnership with Gavi as well that looks at combining hand washing and immunization as two of the most effective ways of reducing child mortality in India. But really, there's a global vaccine summit next week where Gavi hosts its replenishment and hope to get more funding to immunize children around the world. And one of the things they're very concerned about, and other NGOs are worried about, is that during the Ebola pandemic, one of the issues was that more people died of more people died of measles than died of Ebola, because of the fall in the routine immunizations for measles among children that happened during that period, partly because the health systems were disrupted due to the pandemic, but also partly because people were scared to access those services. A similar thing happened with maternal health. So maternal mortality shot up during that time, and almost as many mothers died in childbirth and children from infant mortality in childbirth as died of Ebola because of disruption to maternal health services. So I think there's a broader issue that will affect that part of the world more than most places, in that if essential services are impacted, if donors, attention is distracted, and also if, programs aren't able to run because of the rules around social distancing and in-person contact and simply the constraint of resources in those places, there's a real risk that we go backwards. And I think, as I touched upon earlier, there is you know, it's never been clearer now than ever before that a problem in one part of the world affects the whole world, and will turn, you know, a problem in one part of the world will soon turn up on your doorstep if we don't deal with it as a global community.
Absolutely. Andrew?
I think just very briefly from me, I think I was on a call with all the sub-Saharan African markets this morning, and you know, aside from the in-kind giving I'd mentioned and the cash donations, there are two things we're doing in most of the markets. One is around what Dianne was talking about, which is you know, inclusion when it comes to digital learning. So zero rating the networks. We've spent about 5 years working with Khan Academy, Learning Equality, and all of these content NGOs that are bringing great stuff to market. So we've got about 1 million learners in South Africa free on our eSchool platforms there, and we feel that's a really big contribution that we can make alongside the other things. I think the second thing is as we've seen across all the countries in which we operate during lockdown, the issues around gender-based violence is becoming more and more prevalent. We've been working in that for 10 years. We've got an app which is very popular in a lot of markets called Bright Sky, which gives a lot of information and help and enables people to self-assess whether they are in an abusive relationship and geolocate the nearest services. I was talking to the team this morning about the Joburg contact center around domestic violence and abuse, and we're funding that and talking about the huge rise in numbers of calls to that center. So I think for us, you know, linked again to our core purpose as a company and what we can do, the connectivity around education and digital learning is key at the moment. And also an issue that we feel very strongly about as a company, wanting to be the best employer for women by 2025. You know, this area of domestic violence is key for us, and we're continuing to work in that space, especially at the moment.
Great, thank you, Andrew. So I've just got one last question before we then move to any concluding remarks you have, and there won't be time to give lengthy answers to this, but as I said, I've been in this sector for 25 years, always in the not-for-profit sector. And when I started out in the sector, the attitude in the not-for-profit sector 25 years ago was that, you know, businesses were bad, but they had a lot of money. It was going to be the NGOs that would save the world and change the world. How do we get that money to enable the NGOs to do that? I always stood out a lot at the time because I always felt that actually it was the private sector that was going to change the world for the better in a more powerful way. And I think that's even more so the case now. And when you hear about the examples of the companies that we've highlighted today and the incredible impacts that you're all having for good around the world, I think that absolutely demonstrates that. But, and this is my question, for your organizations and for private organizations to do the tremendous good that you all do, you also have to be very successful organizations. And at the moment, the private sector is grinding to a halt in many parts of it. So what do we as the international global community, what do we do to help keep ensuring that the private sector can continue to be both strong and successful so that organizations like yourselves are able to continue doing the tremendous amount of good that you do? I hope that makes sense, that question. I don't know who'd like to go first. Maybe Louise?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So I think, I mean, this is a really interesting point. I mean, not all private sector organizations are going to make it through, as we've already seen. So it's really challenging. And I think that international community and, you know, government organizations have got a vital role to play in response, recovery, and building resilience. You know, the partnership you've seen with businesses using and purchasing the assets of companies to build recovery programs, that's one example. But, you know, the international sector is also making a huge, you know, kind of contribution to businesses. I mean, the IMF is making their entire $1 trillion balance book available to governments. The World Bank's going to end up lending 105 billion, I think they've said, over the next 18 months. To help governments kind of, you know, support kind of individuals and businesses. And other organizations I've heard of are looking at working with private sector to along the lines of data, along the lines of supporting the tourism and hospitality sectors to help them through this phase, but also helping them longer term to recover and see how that recovery might take place. You know, a little example about how the international organization is helping. A kind of partnership we've got is we're onboarding a number of organizations onto our donation platform, and one of those is Gavi. Also, it's a solidarity fund from WHO as well, to reach out to you know, to personal kind of donors. But you know, the UK government's also matching you know, every donation that comes through for Gavi. So they're real examples of international kind of organizations and the sector kind of helping out. You know, but it is going to be a big impact on small organizations. They have been significantly impacted by cash flow. And some of them find it really challenging to access some of the kind of economic support packages that are available. So I'll leave it at that point.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that, you know, there was an OECD report, I think last week, said 50% of SMEs face severe losses and 33% face bankruptcy. I think somebody mentioned earlier on that the digital infrastructure, those who will survive more, you know, more easily than others, often it will come down to digital infrastructure and the quality and the resilience of that infrastructure. And so I think from our sector, speaking on behalf of all the sector, you know, I think it's government support to those businesses which are absolutely critical to the economy in supporting them in the necessary digital infrastructure that they have to survive and thrive from this appalling situation we're in at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Helen, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think, you know, as well as the most immediate thing that, if we're thinking about what governments can do in this crisis to help businesses, is to, you know, get us out of this pandemic as quickly as possible, find a vaccine, find a treatment, and, you know, using track and trace to help societies go back to normal as quickly as possible. Broader than that as well, I think, you know, going forwards, I hope that the things we've all learned as a world in this crisis will help businesses and governments to act differently, and governments specifically to, you know, reward businesses who do the right thing and who are responsible, and you know, punish and penalise businesses that do not act responsibly or, you know, cause environmental harm or don't act in the best way. And I think, you know, over the next couple of months and years in the recovery from this crisis, we're going to see a huge amount injected into global economies. And really that money should be used in a way that, you know, if we're thinking about the climate crisis we have or inequality across the world, it should seek to address those core issues in the best way possible. And, you know, we've been warned by Bill Gates about a pandemic for many years, but actions were not taken. Similarly, we've been warned about a climate crisis and the threat and the action we need to take now. So I would hope that in the move to a recovery, governments would really heed those warnings and take action.
Right, maybe Dianne, maybe you could just make sure that the UN makes sure that every government in the world does that, please.
Well, I just wanted to add one thing, in that the businesses that are going to survive this are going to be the ones that care about their communities and about the individual. So really this boils down to, you know, what value are you adding to the individual and to the community? You know, smart cities was last year. That's all we were talking about. And now we're talking about how do we help our communities survive? So even a big city built on communities. So I would say, I think there's quite a bit of data that suggests that the businesses that come out of this, we have the data from China, are the ones that actually have proven to be very transparent and caring about their the people that they serve and the people that are their customers. And I think all of these companies, I mean, preaching to the choir, but I hope, you know, hopefully other companies that are listening will prove to be successful in that, because that's what we really need now. It's about the individual.
Great, thank you very much. In a great example of terrible chairing, I'm afraid we only have about 1 minute left, but so I'm sorry if you prepared anything to close with that you haven't been able to say, but I think all of you have been able to get across most of the points I think we discussed earlier, but I just have a look at all of you to see if there is any final words that any of you would like to say specifically that you've not been able to make. No, I think that's, so let me just, on behalf of the World Humanitarian Forum, as I said, I'm on the advisory board for the forum, but thank all four of you for tremendous contributions today. I've certainly learnt a lot, and I found that discussion fascinating. And I'm sure all of the participants that have been watching have as well. There's been lots of interesting comments on the chat, and it seems that all of your contributions have been extremely welcome. So on behalf of the World Humanitarian Forum, thank you all very, very much indeed for giving up your time and preparing today. It's been very good to get to know you as we've prepared for this. And for everybody watching, I'd encourage you to keep watching out for the rest of this digital program that the World Humanitarian Forum is putting on to keep these debates going as we try to emerge from this global crisis that we've all been experiencing. So thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.